Well, welcome everyone. Our two speakers today are Peter Grajzl and Peter Murrell, who have been very prolific in recent years in using AI techniques, topic modeling, to go through legal and other documents to cast very important insights on economic development, particularly in Britain. And I think this work is quite revolutionary in its implications for our understanding of that period. And sometime a bit earlier, they've been working on various key texts and key players. A paper on Francis Bacon, for example, which is very interesting. But on the topic of this talk, it's much more specifically about the possibility of Darwinian precursors, people fumbled with a theory of evolution before it was formulated by Darwin himself in The Origin of Species in 1859. And it's a lot earlier, and they're going to talk about that. So welcome, Peter and Peter. Very good to have you with us. I'll hand over for your talk, please.
Okay, I'm going to handle the bulk of the talk, but Peter is going to come in and amplify and correct me and so on, and tell me if the screen I'm referring to is actually not showing on Teams, because I'm not quite used to Teams at the moment. So hopefully you can all see the slides right now, and I'll go ahead. Let me just say that sometimes during this presentation I might slip into saying I, and that will be purely inadvertent. All of this work is Peter and me together, and I think we've now been really working on this stuff intensively for probably close to 10 years now. And the start of the work really was precipitated by the existing economics literature, where people talked, of course, very much about the English 17th century as the time when things started to change within England, precursor to many revolutions: financial, agricultural, industrial, scientific, and so on. And the predominant paradigm within economics at that point was that the institutional creation that underlie all these developments was one that was designed. There's no other word really to use to describe the types of theories. It was forward-looking optimization by powerful political actors. And so when we began this work, that was the image that we had in mind that was cast by the economics literature. But I think from very early on, we had a different image. By the way, the critical point in all of this literature is the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and particularly the Bill of Rights of 1689 and the Act of Settlement of 1701. And our first thought was, well, we knew how important case law was and is in England, and we knew that it had a very strong legal system. And so we thought, well, let's read the works of those people who are actually creating case law, the judges and lawyers, to see what they thought about institutional creation. And that was really the start of all of this work. We looked at what the judges, lawyers, legal scholars said, and immediately we were struck with the conclusion that, well, here's some sort of inchoate Darwinism that's going on in what they thought. And so we thought, how can we construct an argument to show that this is really there? And I want to emphasize all the time that I'm talking is when we're talking about Darwinism, we're obviously not talking about anything rigorous that conforms to modern standards, but the hints, a sort of underlying feeling that they have some type of evolutionary notion of the creation of institutions going on in their heads. And so how could we construct this argument? Well, we first of all, really wanted to isolate the core features of modern social science Darwinism as a sort of template against which we could judge the statements that the judges, lawyers, and legal scholars made in the 17th century. And I should emphasize that a lot of these statements don't really come from legal cases so much as compendia of the law at that time, from things like when Cook, the famous judge, wrote the introduction to his compendia of legal cases and so on. So they come from when they were thinking broader about the process in which they were engaged. So one of our important tasks was to look at the current literature on evolutionary thinking on social phenomena, and it's compendious, and we tried to come up with some sort of crude essence of this literature. We found Jeff's works incredibly helpful in this, and so we wanted to get sort of I have to say, a crude summary of this literature, focusing on its essence and thinking about how it could be cast in the context of law and in the context of the development, in particular, of case law. So what we first of all did is look at the key structures in this literature, and everything begins with replicators, I guess, entities that pass on their structure largely intact in successive replications. And to us, the big replicator of the legal system is the actual legal rules. The specific points that people are agreed upon as a summary of the law and the types of things that judges would invoke in court in short aphorisms to justify the way they're making decisions. And in order to make this a little bit more grounded, for this talk, I've constructed this discussion of one pivotal financial issue that arose in the 1690s and in the decade afterwards. And this really was a pivotal financial issue. If this is ever written up, we will choose the title of something like How Paper Money Came to England. And this was the rules for different financial instruments. Now, very quickly in terms of terminology, at this time, of course, all currency was still based on metallic coins. And metallic coins had the property that they did not have any distinguishing mark of who they came from and so on. And they could be easily assigned to somebody else just by physical exchange. So the question about financial instruments was threefold. One is whether they're assignable, whether the original owner could assign them to another person, give the rights to that instrument to another person. And this particularly arose in the case of bills of exchange, which were essentially a way of arranging payments for the supply of goods. And very early on in merchant custom, these were made assignable to another person. Then, of course, the question really becomes a very much a legal one of whether the person to whom these instruments are assigned has rights to bring suit to get payment. Without those rights to bring suit, of course, the instrument is valueless to the assignee. And of course, the assignee is often a succession of people. And in the end, what the assignee becomes is just the possessor of this piece of paper. Now, that's not all of the legal question that arises in this, because once somebody has been assigned this paper instrument, the question is what is their property in it? And this was the central legal question at the turn of the 17th century into the 18th century. The point of law was that the law had to decide, given this long chain of passage of this paper instrument, to what extent the person who owned it or possessed it had perfect property rights in it. Now, there are cases in our lives, I presume we've all encountered, where we actually encountered this phenomenon. When we buy houses, we pay a lot of cash for them, and we receive a piece of property. Now, there will be a long time that passes when people check whether we really have property rights in that property. What is the long chain of circumstances? In the case of the money that we give in payment for that property, nobody checks. It's just money. Everybody accepts it. And in fact, it's a point of law about currency that it doesn't require check, that the person who has the money has perfect title to that money. And that was the issue with financial instruments. That was the focal of this sort of evolutionary episode that I'll talk about in the turn of the 17th century into the 18th century. And of course, in that situation, we don't have the legal rules battling against each other. We have the interactors challenging each other. The interactors, they host replicators, and they interact with the environment, and they are subject to selection. And in law, this can occur at multiple levels. And the lawyers talked about all the different levels. It can be statutes challenging precedential cases, and the reverse, new cases challenging statutes. In the English system at that time, customs were incredibly important. So somebody could come to court and say, there is this identifiable custom, and it has created an obligation onto some other legal person, and that is the legal rule that's applicable, not some statute, not some particular case. And then, of course, at a higher level, we have jurists attached to particular precedential cases, political factions who have an economic interest in what the legal rule is. And at the very highest level, we have legal systems battling each other. And when we come to the quotes of the jurists, of the lawyers at that time, we'll see they really did talk about legal systems being chosen between. So in the case that I'm talking about in terms of these financial instruments, what happened is that bills of exchange, which were connected with payments for the exchange of goods, pretty readily in custom and in law had all the attributes of money, essentially. And so once somebody was in possession of one of those bills of exchange, then they would have full title in the rights that that bill gave the possessor. But we have a situation in the second half of the 17th century in England when currency is very scarce, metallic currency is very scarce. The creation of bills of exchange is limited by the amount of trade that's going on, and there's a demand for liquidity. So essentially what was happening was that gradually there evolved this system where a set of bankers were receiving deposits of metallic currency and issuing promissory notes on them. So these were not connected to actual goods trade, but they were connected to just the issuing of a note which provided essentially evidence that the person had a deposit with those bankers. And at this time, the rules and customs came into conflict. So the statutes were essentially out of date. The important thing was that there was this established merchant custom gradually came into being in the second half of the 17th century, that the legal rule was that any possessor of a promissory note who came by possession in a legal manner had full rights, full property rights. But a judge, for some reason, and this is still debated in history of why this was the case, came up with a ruling in Chancery that merchant custom did not apply in this case, that promissory notes did not have the same legal rules attached to them that the bills of exchange did. So we really have a conflict between interactors here, very clearly. There was the legal system and the precedential cases and established merchant custom. And so that clash of the interactors was going to determine which replicator, which legal rule was going to survive. So all of this, of course, is shaped by the environment, and given what I've said, it's sort of obvious what elements there are in the environment. There's the structure of the legal system. At various points in time, there were highly, highly influential judges. There were merchants, and there was actually the question of who was a merchant under the law and legal rule. And that was resolved before the end of the 17th century, that anybody who dealt in this paper essentially was a merchant for that particular situation. And there are also, the environment is shaped by these large-scale external events. One thing that's important in the case of these promissory notes is that the colonies became hugely important in their trade, basically through London, in the latter part of the 17th century. And what that meant is that that trade needed more liquidity. And that's part of the story of the creation by merchants of these promissory notes. So the stock of replicators is the precedents, the old out-of-date statutes, the new customs, and we have judges with their particular point of view who've essentially put a stop to the solid legal basis of these promissory notes. And there's Parliament with a great interest in this because the merchants have influence on Parliament a lot at this time. And what commerce needed was these new money-like instruments. Now, one thing you'll notice is that I haven't mentioned the Bank of England at this time. And one of the points we will make if we ever write this up in a paper is how little influence the Bank of England actually had in the whole process by which money, modern money, came to England. But that's a sideshow for this presentation. So we have the competition between the actors, between different varieties of legal rules attached to the interactors. Why is there differential attachment? Well, this is the type of question only an economist would think it's necessary to answer, I think, because really every time we think about something that it talks about knowledge and so on, we have to carefully throw out the straw man of, a group of highly rational, forward-looking actors who can forecast the future. And so what we see in the lawyers' statements is, not surprisingly, that their world does not consist of these highly rational actors forecasting the future, especially about law. Everything they talk about with law is a group of people, shall we say, bumbling into the future. That's too strong, but that's the sense in which one gets of their writings. And of course, variation comes through cognitive separation. The judges are trained in thinking about how the law works. The merchants are trained in or grow up with skills about how to get the economy moving and so on. There's geographical separation between legal systems and so on. And there's also changing socioeconomic practices. Well, merchant custom was changing at this time because of the increasing use of these promissory notes. So we have these forces with different attachment to different interactors. And, a couple of words here are useful. I mean, we always think about notes of money. Where did these arise? These arose from goldsmith bankers. So from bankers who originally dealt in metallic specie. And essentially the way the promissory notes first arose is that people deposited their coins with the goldsmith bankers. The goldsmith bankers thought of them as money that was a commodity, essentially. They melted them down, sold them for a profit. And so, there was the original coins were not in the bank at all. And in order to get security on their deposits, the depositors were given these promissory notes. So here we have the movement from metallic money to this paper liquidity. So what happens is that the interactors are selected between by all of these forces, and that will mean the selection for replicators. And, you know, then we have the characteristic Darwinian process. You'll have differential perpetuation of different replicators, that is, different legal rules. And that will lead to population level changes in the distribution of legal rules in society. So there's one interesting quote that I don't think I'll get to today about how primogeniture spread across England because of a particular set of property rights that were in one particular jurisdiction that won out and then gradually spread across the counties of England. So what was the outcome on the promissory notes? As I said before, we have the merchants influential in Parliament, in direct conflict for a few years with the judges, the important judges. And there was a question of whether these promissory notes would become more money-like or not. And it was basically, you know, a duel, so to speak, between these two forces. The merchants were very strong in Parliament. Parliament, which it didn't do very often, wrote a statute, passed a statute that overruled the judges. And so the winning interactor was the merchants in Parliament in a statute called the Statute of Anne. And the new rule was endorsed that promissory notes were essentially the equivalent of money. And what did that mean at this time? That meant crucially that a person who came into possession of a promissory note, who was assigned a promissory note in a legal way, had full title to what that promissory note promised. And the examples of where this was a particular issue are always in the case of people who lost notes, had them stolen. And the person who found the note, lost note, or stole it, sold it to another person who legitimately believed that the seller was a bona fide owner. The person who believed that the seller was a bona fide owner immediately under this new law became the bona fide owner. And if the person who lost the note or had it stolen wanted to sue for the value of the note, they could not sue the possessor of the note, but they had to sue the person who found the note or stole the note. And if you think about it, this is exactly how money works. We get it, and we don't have to think about whether there was a chain of circumstances that legally got us into possession of the note. We only have to think about the immediate acquisition of the note. And then there was retention of this legal rule. I mean, it survived today in the contracts of merchants, and noticeably, in this case, there were a number of future judgments that clarified the rule, but always by that time, the judges accepted the decision of the winning interactors, so to speak, that the legal rule was bona fide ownership. So this is a sort of application of the concepts of socioeconomic Darwinism, if I can call it that, to the legal situation. And the second part of our paper is all about justifying whether the judges and lawyers had that point of view. And here, I'm afraid our presentation cannot do justice to our paper. I mean, this is a core part of the paper, obviously, but it consists of lots of quotes organized into certain categories, showing what these judges and lawyers and legal scholars thought about the world. And unfortunately, the language is quite complex. And so we would all get lost if we went through all of these quotes together. So I'm just going to give a sampling of their words here. And looking at certain areas of this socioeconomic Darwinism. First of all, we'll talk about how the lawyers thought about people as boundedly rational agents in this complex world that was so hard to understand. Then we'll talk about the core elements of Darwinian processes and, you know, what they said about those. And then we'll talk about outcomes of the Darwinian processes. So this is going to move 10 times, 100 times quicker than the paper does and have a lot less evidence, but that's necessary in such a talk. So first of all, these agents sort of going through the world darkly, looking for something to do. And Hale, who was one of the most prominent lawyers, he was the top lawyer in the country, both under Cromwell and under Charles II. And that really shows both the status of law and the status of Hale. And he said, there are many things in law reasonable to be approved, though the reason of the party doth not see its reasonableness. And here, there's a nice nuance to the way English people used the word reasonable at that time. It both meant, you know, the modern meaning, which is, you know, sort of having good properties, but it also meant based on reason. So people really couldn't understand good law necessarily. And this was something that was carried through right until the end of the century and afterwards. Here we have Algernon Sidney, who was actually sometimes described as the last person to suffer capital punishment for being a member of a political party in England. And his statement of the wisdom of man is imperfect and unable to foresee the effects of an infinite variety of accidents. So there we have, you know, the variety of accidents is the randomness of the environment, and the lawyers could not envisage in a complex way the result of what they were doing. They had to choose a reasonable option given their highly incomplete knowledge. Where did variation come from? A lot of different sources. And here's Hale again. Of all kind of subjects, there is none so great a difficulty for the faculty of reason to guide itself and come to any steadiness as that of laws. So Hale was saying here that, you know, even people in the same position would see things quite differently. And that's, of course, why you had these long, complex arguments in the reports of cases, judges debating what actually the law was and what to do. The variation in England came also from the fact that there were many competing laws legal systems that had affected the country. Bacon, most famous for his scientific epistemology, was of course fundamentally a lawyer first and foremost, and he remarked that the laws of England are compounded of British, Roman, Saxon, Danish, Norman customs. And also at the time, of course, there was competing canon law in England, civil law based on the Roman law. I should perhaps call it the Roman law in this case. The universities, Cambridge and Oxford at that time, were bastions of the civil law system as opposed to the common law system. So there was constant competition because of the variation between the ideas coming from those universities and coming from um, the law courts, the Inns of Court in London. Selection. Here we have a couple of interesting contrasts in the way that selection occurred. Cook was perhaps next to Hale a rival for the greatest English judge in history. Davis was an extremely influential lawyer who was actually Attorney General and a judge in Ireland, where custom was competing against an imposed common law from England. So for Cook, the selection was mainly through the judges. The laws have been refined by the wisdom of the most excellent men in many successions of ages. And he's talking about judges choosing between legal rules and deciding which one is authoritative. Davis, in contrast, emphasized custom. For where the people find any act to be good and beneficial, they use and practice it. And so by frequent repetition, a custom is formed. And being used time out of mind, it obtains the force of law. So customs, repetition, selection of customs, then becoming law. And this phrasing here, time out of mind, is absolutely crucial at that time. Basically, what it referred to is that if a custom was introduced in court, then the judges would immediately ask, is there any person alive who can remember a time when that custom did not exist? If the answer to that is no, then that meant that this custom is actually a part of law. It has the property that it can impose obligations on to legal actors. So I use the word Darwinian processes here, and it's interesting that that word was not used in the 17th century, but what one finds is that the word time is used in a very, very similar way. That time is the process. Okay, so replication with retention, that's very important. And of course, central to that is precedent and the following of precedent. And Bacon again here is the quote we've chosen to emphasize. The customs of the realm, getting once an entry, are hardened by succession, that is repeated use, and after defended as firm and stable laws. And you have replication. Decisions of courts of justice have a great authority in declaring what the law is, especially when such decisions hold a constancy and congruity with decisions of former time. So, did they have any notion of what the properties of this process of time led to, what the outcomes were? Well, certainly they thought of the process of the building of law as unguided change. Law is not the result of this or that council or senate, but the production of the various experiences and application of time, of the process that we've talked about. And here I notice in preparing these slides, Hale has appeared many times, and that's totally inadvertent. I meant to have actually a better selection of people, but I think this shows you how important this person, Matthew Hale, was in the development of legal philosophy at this time. There are many cases to be made that he was a more important lawyer for the development of the legal system than anybody else in the 17th century, including Coke, who preceded him. Coke and all the other lawyers emphasize gradual change. Nature, which is the best guide, makes no leap. And can I ask now what the timing is? I've lost track of time.
You've been talking for 45 minutes, Peter.
Oh, okay. So let me just wrap up in a few minutes. Of course, there is always this discussion when we're talking about Darwinianism as whether optimality is global or local. And it's interesting that the lawyers at this time had exactly the same debate. This is a rather long quote, but it's probably one of the most quoted by other people during the 17th century, most quoted during those times. So what Fortescue, a famous constitutional lawyer of the 16th century, said was, you know, there were various influences on the law, which if they were not above all exception good, no doubt, but some or other of those kings, those previous kings, from a principle of justice, in point of reason or moved by inclination, would have made some alteration or quite abolished them. But that was certainly modified by later thinkers. Bacon realized that, you know, we're not talking about global optimality. What is settled by custom, though it be not good, yet at least it is not fit. Path dependence. There was a very clear notion of this, and in fact, it was accepted by law. So things can arise through random accident, error. Yet the retention and replication, the long use and multitude of precedents must draw it into law. Common error makes law. And there's a very strong statement. We would attach the term path dependence to it nowadays. There's also a notion of speciation. For there are in nature certain fountains of justice from which all civil laws are derived as streams. And as waters take tinctures from the soils through which they run, so do civil laws vary according to the regions and governments where they are planted, though they proceed from the same fountains. So there's a certain sense here in Bacon that it's natural law that begins everything, and then it's acted on by the institutional structures of each society to have different tinctures in each society. And here, I think, given the timing, I'd like to stop. These are lesser points, and unfortunately, well, let me get to this slide of the conclusion. Why is the question that I've just tried to answer important? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is going back to the way I introduced this talk, where do the ideas come from that began England's rise? And there is no doubt about the fact that lawyers were more prominent in English society at that point than perhaps any point in history. They were hugely influential in politics. London's Inns of Court, where lawyers studied and judges lived and interacted with students, were called the Third University. And it was sort of like finishing school for many of the upper classes. So even though many of these people did not become lawyers, a huge proportion of the upper classes spent some time being educated at London's Inns of Court. So many people have talked about the language of law was the language of socioeconomic analysis at that time in England. And if one reads debates about the Bill of Rights of 1689 and so on, one sees that language really all the way through those debates. The other general importance is something which the members of this Darwin Club community have much more authority to talk about than I do, which is the intellectual history. How this point came to influence other people. Burke, for instance, was very much indebted to this way of thinking, although Burke sort of deviated from it a great deal by emphasizing, shall we say, the 100% certainty that what we inherited was the best thing, rather than the lawyers thinking about constant change and so on. And Hayek really uses this perspective to analyze the English 17th century and cites Matthew Hale a lot. And this is something that I have no authority to comment on. That is, did this prepare the ground for Darwin? Is there a line of thinking that went all the way from the lawyers to English society in the 19th century? Unfortunately, I've strayed over my time and we do not get to all the current research we're doing on this topic. I will say that what the general notion that this first study in this whole area of research gave us was how important the words were to understand how people thought. And that led us to think, well, how can we use those words? That made us turn to modern machine learning. And essentially our projects since then have used machine learning to quantify ideas in the development of them throughout this time period and relate these to real economic happenings. So at that point, I'll stop. I don't know if Peter wants to add anything at this point.
No, I'm happy to open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. That was really stimulating. Anyone like to raise their hand for make a contribution? I just put something in the Marion. I just put something in the chat. I did a blog recently about the word replication, where it comes from, and according to my JSTOR search, it comes from law. So actually, some of these terms in modern Darwinian theory have a legal origin. I mean, you can click on that blog, which it's in the chat. Marion, please.
I was just going to ask, you mentioned the terms "if acquired legally" in your discussion of promissory notes before you got to the legislation. And I was just wondering, was that generally kind of accepted, that that was required to make them all right, and even before the legislation was passed?
Well, the question of it's the question of what all right means there, and really what you need if you acquire a promissory note is the ability to sue to get what the promissory note promises. And the cases that actually followed the law, the statute, were all in situations where a bank had refused to pay on a promissory note when asked by the current possessor of the note, because the original owner of the note had lost it and blocked payment in the bank. And essentially, what that meant is that the original owner of the note had to show that the possessor came by the note by other than a normal legal process of exchange. So really the force of this change in the law was basically where the burden of proof lay. So before things were clear, the possessor might have to prove that he or she actually came by this thing legally and go back over the whole chain of exchange for this note. But what the statute said is essentially that a possessor is deemed to have full title in the note, and if there are objections to that, then the burden of proof belongs on the shoulders of the objector.
It's interesting because this all still hangs around today. You know, they arrest a bunch of guys with some drugs and guns and money, and then they say, well, that money was obtained illegally, you know, and then they say, well, no. And it's interesting that this has a long,
I mean,
even with real money.
Today, there have been lots of changes in the law. I mean, in the United States, it's now if you have more than $10,000 cash and you use it to pay something for something, then you have to prove you came by that legally. But that's, you know, that's a modern twist on this whole thing about who has the rights.
Well, thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Dick Langwell.
Oh yeah, this is really fascinating. I have a couple of questions. One is just a question of clarification for my own ignorance, and then maybe a slightly more substantive question. So the difference between a promissory note and a bill of exchange is that the bill of exchange has more conditions on it, like you could have an expiration date or something. It's more like a bank check. Is that the idea? Whereas the promissory note is a bearer bond and anybody can use it. Because bills of exchange were circulating since the Middle Ages, right?
Yeah, and I actually think they can be almost the same, except in their origin. You know, that the bill of exchange a ruse by definition in the carrying out of a contract for the exchange of goods, whereas the promissory note a ruse just out of a pure promise, essentially, not associated at all with the exchange of goods. And that,
I see.
I think that really sort of explains a lot of why this disjunction in the law between the two things arose at that time. And, you know, to us, it seems they're both the same. You know, they're a promise to pay some money. And at the time, these distinctions were much more important to the lawyers.
Right. The other thing I was going to ask about is you didn't mention the law merchant, but you did talk a lot about custom. And the story I had always heard is that the law merchant was absorbed into the common. Probably about the time that you're talking about the law merchant, which evolved sort of in the Middle Ages, was absorbed into the common law. And what I took from what you were saying today is that there were many more customs that were absorbed into the common law, not just the law merchant. But on the other hand, if we're going to talk about bills of exchange and promissory notes, surely that was in the law merchant. And so there was probably some Darwinian process that was going on even earlier than this in the Middle Ages, where the merchants themselves were developing these customs. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that. I think you're muted, Peter.
You're muted. Put your mic on.
Am I there now?
Yeah, you're okay now.
Sorry about that.
It's my fault.
So this is not exactly my specialty of knowing all about the law merchant, but so I'll give the best answer I can, which is that in the Middle Ages there were special courts where essentially the law merchant was their law, but they were not the same as the common law. And everything, you know, those courts gradually vanished, and by the time I'm talking about, everything was the common law plus the one part of civil law that England had, which was in the Chancery. But the Chancery worked in a very similar way to the common law on some things. And so the question was, what was the relationship between customs and the common law, essentially? And the common law said that customs were part of the common law. That was it. They were part of the common law. And so the issue always came to be, could you prove the particular thing that you're talking about was an established custom? And that's where this time out of mind came. And so actually any custom could be part of the common law. There were, of course, rules about if it conflicted with precedential cases and so on. But in the situation of promissory notes, their particular uses at that time were very new. I mean, they had been used, of course, for, I'm sure there are Old Testament references to such things, but these were particularly new uses by the goldsmith bankers.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Anybody else? I've got a question I'd like to ask. How would we show any influence or any connection between the hypothesis that these early legal theorists were thinking about processes which look like Darwinism. And I think you've established that. And the later appearance of the Darwinian theory with Darwin himself. I mean, as far as we're aware, to check these details, but Darwin never studied law or even any social science. He studied medicine and, of course, botany and other things, but seemed to have little contact with legal theory. Yet this correspondence is quite striking. So have you got a PhD student or someone who could work on this?
No, I would tell you where I would start, though. I would find out if Darwin read any Dickens. If you read Dickens, in all of Dickens, the law and this way of thinking about life goes all the way through. And I'm not exactly a avid reader of 19th century fiction, but you see it in other places, George Eliot and so on. So one wonders whether that this was sort of part of the overall thinking of society at that time.
There's also, if I may be a bit heretical, there's another possibility. If you don't believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, and it was written instead not by the Stratford man, but by a guy called Edward de Vere, which is a theory. You can look that up. De Vere had a legal training in Inns of Court. There's no evidence that the man from Stratford did. But Shakespeare's work, whoever wrote it, is full of legal terminology. So whoever wrote it and wherever they got the ideas from, Shakespeare too is a major influence, possible influence.
Yeah.
And there is a third story that I was musing about as we were preparing this presentation, because I told Peter, I said, somebody's going to ask us a question of that type, the question that you, Jeff, just asked. So what I read is that Darwin apparently was heavily influenced by Bacon, and of course relied heavily on induction.
Yeah.
Darwin in his own reasoning. And then the question is where Bacon came from, and some people would think that Bacon came from nowhere, and these ideas came from nowhere. But our earlier work actually shows that Bacon's ideas were intimately tied to his training in the common law and in that culture and understanding of those institutions. So that might be another heretical claim now.
Yeah, I think that's very plausible. I mean, Bacon remained very influential, and Darwin had some training in philosophy. He would have known about Bacon, certainly.
Yeah. In fact, there is a quote of Darwin quoting Bacon, apparently.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So I mean, and Joel McKeer also emphasizes the influence of Bacon, but misses the legal part of the story, which you have shown very clearly that's very important for Bacon in his whole philosophical thinking. But I think there's some work to be done there because, I mean, is it the zeitgeist? Is it the nature of British history, the nature of the common law system that just imbues people with a way of thinking about process and change? Or is it something else? I mean, I think the existence of a common law system may be a crucial factor, and the way people reflected on it.
But let me just say one thing about the common law there is nowadays. I mean, of course, the country where I was born, Britain, and grew up, and the country where I live now, both have the common law system. But going back to that first slide about how we started thinking about this project, I've always been really, really stunned by how differently English people and Americans think about the way institutions developed and so on. Of course, there, the crucial incident might have been this little thing that happened in 1776 to 1789 and in the American side. And there, you know, the myth is a new nation was created out of a blank slate, essentially. So, I mean, the common law certainly does not provide the whole explanation. It has to be something about the survival of it in Britain, the survival of the ideas from the common law in Britain, and so on.
Yeah, point taken. Another point is to look, instead of looking backwards, looking after Darwin and seeing who made connections between the law and Darwinian style evolution, for want of a better phrase. Now, the obvious example is Commons, John Rogers Commons, the American institutionalist, who in his key works like The Legal Foundation of Capitalism actually says it's like Darwinism, but he calls it artificial selection because human agents are involved, which is a bit misleading. But he nevertheless is alluding to a Darwinian style process in law where judges make decision and select one set of rules over possibly another set of rules or reinforce a set of rules. But I wonder between Commons in 1924 and Darwin 1859, is anybody else? I mean, there's Walter Bagehot, who talked about politics as an evolutionary process. As I recollect, he didn't particularly mention law. There's Henry Maine, who had a theory of evolution of law, but as far as I recollect, didn't refer to Darwin. So I think there's another story there about the subsequent realization of possible connections between the legal sphere and the biological evolution.
Well, it's taking us 10 years to move about a century forward in our studies, so maybe
Yes.
in another 30 years we'll be up to there.
Yeah. But it's a great set of questions, and I think you both to be congratulated on bringing these ideas to our attention. I think they're very important in a number of ways. The number of projects for the history of ideas, there's a number of implications for legal and economic history. It's a very, very rich vein of ideas that you're opening up.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you both very, very much for extremely stimulating talk. The talk that Peter and Peter gave was based on a particular paper, which, if I recollect, was published in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. But they have a number of other papers on the themes relating to their argument, including these machine learning studies of legal text, legal and other texts at the time, which I do strongly recommend if you haven't come across them already, if you're particularly interested in this area. And I think there's an important dialogue to be had with people working in legal theory and evolutionary ideas in legal theory, which is also opened up by this. So thank you very much again. It's been extremely stimulating. Thank you for coming, and thank you everyone else for attending. And if you're watching this on a recording, I hope you enjoy the recording as well. So, and thanks for Brian for organizing that.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.